On the morning of March 12, 1834, beneath the wrought iron balconies of Charleston's most exclusive gentlemen's club, a wager was struck that would scandalize South Carolina society for decades. Mrs. Helena Whitmore, widow of tobacco magnate Edmund Whitmore and mistress of Rosemont Plantation, accepted a bet from her brother that she could not civilize and marry the most unsuitable man in the county within 6 months. The target they selected was Isaac, her own enslaved cook, a man who weighed nearly 400 pounds and had never spoken a word in the 15 years he had lived in bondage. What began as drunken sport among bored aristocrats became something far stranger. By September, Helena Whitmore stood before a minister and legally married the man she had owned as property just months before. But the ceremony was only the beginning of a mystery that would end with 11 people dead, a plantation in ruins, and a truth so disturbing that Charleston's elite spent the next 30 years ensuring it never reached official records. I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to hear has been buried in family archives and courthouse basements for nearly 2 centuries. And I want to know where you're listening from. Drop your state or city in the comments. I'm curious how far this story travels. The Charleston Club sat like a relic of the British Empire, its pillars tall and white against the early spring sunlight of 1834. Inside, tobacco smoke hung thick in the air, curling lazily beneath chandeliers of imported glass. Leather chairs creaked under the weight of men who measured their worth not in coin but in lineage. The sound of laughter, sharp, indulgent, and cruel, echoed across the paneled room as Marcus Whitmore slammed his glass onto the table and announced the wager that would doom his sister. Helena Whitmore had entered the club with a purpose. That morning, a rare transgression in itself. For women were not welcome within its walls except as topics of conversation. But Marcus had sent for her, claiming urgent business concerning their late father's estate. When she arrived, she found him surrounded by half a dozen of Charleston's wealthiest planters, men already flushed from drink despite the early hour. The sight alone should have warned her, but Helena, dressed in widow's black, her gloved hands steady, carried herself like a woman accustomed to humiliation and determined to outlast it. Marcus rose with mock gallantry as she entered. "My dearest sister," he said, bowing low, "the savior of Rosemont Plantation herself. Do come in. We were just discussing what it means to be a true Whitmore." Helena ignored the sneer in his voice and took her seat. "If this is about the loan, Marcus, I've already secured a meeting with the factor. I don't require your assistance." "Ah, but you will," he replied, swirling the last of his wine. "Because your husband's debts exceed even your vanity." Laughter rippled around the table. "And because I have a proposition, one that will amuse everyone here." He gestured for more brandy. "We all know my sister's belief that breeding and education can make a lady or a gentleman out of anyone. So, let us test it. I wager she cannot civilize and marry the most unsuitable man in the county within 6 months." The room erupted. Some shouted names of drunks, debtors, and lunatics, but it was Marcus who silenced them with a raised hand and a smile that carried venom. "No, not one of our own fallen angels. Let her choose from her own property. A slave, perhaps. One of those she claims to treat so humanely." Helena's heart froze, though her face did not betray it. "You would make a mockery of the dead," she said coolly. "Edmund is scarcely 6 months buried. And already your debts outweigh your mourning," Marcus countered. "Come now, sister. 6 months. If you fail, Rosemont becomes mine. If you succeed, I will pay every note, every mortgage, every creditor's claim. You'll have your fortune back, and I'll have the satisfaction of watching you try." Silence followed, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant clatter of carriage wheels on Meeting Street. Every man present leaned forward, hungry for scandal. Helena met her brother's eyes and saw what lay behind the wager, not mischief, but hatred, sharpened by envy. He wanted her ruined, reduced to nothing. And yet, beneath her shock, another thought stirred cold, calculating, and dangerous. "What proof shall bind your word?" she asked. Marcus blinked, surprised. "My word is my bond." "That has never been true," she replied. "You will put it in writing, signed and witnessed by all present, and I will accept." The laughter returned, but it sounded uncertain now. The men sensed something shifting. A line crossed that no one had expected her to approach. Marcus, caught between pride and disbelief, called for parchment and ink. When the agreement was drafted, Helena read it aloud herself, her voice steady over the rising murmur. She signed her name in a firm, deliberate hand, Helena Whitmore, widow of Edmund Whitmore, and left the club without another word. Behind her, the laughter resumed, louder this time, almost desperate, but Marcus did not join in. For the first time, he saw something in his sister's eyes that unsettled him, not defiance, but intent. By the time she reached her carriage, the wager had already begun to spread through Charleston like spilled ink on linen. And before the week was out, every parlor and wharf would be whispering the same name, Helena Whitmore, and the cook she meant to marry. The first record of Isaac appears in the Charleston slave ledgers of June 1819, identified only by a single line: male, age, approximately 16, heavy build, mute, kitchen-trained, purchased for $200 by Edmund Whitmore of Rosemont Plantation. The price alone made him an anomaly. Healthy adolescent males fetched twice that sum, sometimes 3 times if their teeth were good and their backs unscarred. Yet Edmund had been shrewd. What he saw in Isaac was not strength for the fields, but the rare combination of obedience and endurance suited for the suffocating heat of the kitchen. When Helena first saw him, he was little more than a shadow in the background of her new household. A mountain of a boy bent over the scullery table, scrubbing copper pots until his reflection swam in the metal. The other servants spoke for him, saying he had never uttered a word since arriving. They called him Big Isaac to distinguish him from a smaller boy who tended the pantry. The nickname stuck, half affectionate, half fearful. In the years that followed, Isaac's silence became part of Rosemont's atmosphere, as constant as the smell of bread and the creak of the windmill. He communicated in gestures, a nod, a shake of the head, a tap on the table for yes. The other servants learned to read him the way they read the weather, and Helena, absorbed in her husband's endless social entertainments, rarely thought of him beyond the meals he produced. But Edmund noticed he was a man who prided himself on efficiency, on the quiet machinery of his estate running smoothly. Isaac became indispensable not because he was brilliant, but because he never faltered. He worked through storms, fevers, and the temper tantrums of the household staff. He never argued, never broke dishes, never needed correction. When visitors praised the food at Rosemont, Edmund would grin and say, "My cook doesn't waste words. He lets the work speak." There were darker uses for silence, too. During Edmund's frequent absences, Helena sometimes retreated to the kitchen late at night, unable to sleep, pacing barefoot on the cool flagstones. She would find Isaac awake, still stoking the coals, his enormous frame outlined in the dim orange light. He never looked at her directly, but always seemed to sense her presence before she spoke. In those quiet hours, she sometimes imagined he could hear her thoughts, that the heavy air between them carried things she could not say aloud. By 1834, Isaac was no longer a boy, but a man whose sheer size dominated any room he entered. He moved with surprising grace, a kind of quiet precision that unsettled guests who expected clumsiness. Some whispered that he had been made monstrous by overeating or by the indolence of servitude. Others said his muteness was punishment from God, a curse for some unknown sin. But those who worked beside him knew better. They said Isaac remembered everything, every recipe, every household secret, every whispered argument behind closed doors. When Helena's husband died that autumn, it was Isaac who prepared the funeral meal, who polished the silver and baked the bread, served to mourners who spoke in hushed tones about the widow's fortune and her late husband's debts. It was Isaac who stood at the back of the hall, motionless, as prayers were read and condolences offered. Some of the guests swore afterward that he had wept, though no one could recall hearing him make a sound. After the funeral, Helena began sorting through Edmund's papers, uncovering the lies and loans that would soon destroy her. She barely noticed that Isaac had taken to lingering near the library door, as if waiting for instruction that never came. What she didn't realize, what no one at Rosemont realized, was that Isaac had been watching her for years, learning her moods, her fears, and her solitude. He had memorized the rhythm of her days, the way she paused before answering, the way her hands trembled slightly when signing her name. And though no one had ever heard him speak, Isaac understood language better than most who used it freely. He had learned it not from tutors, but from observation, from the spaces between words, from gestures, from the way power moved through silence. So when Helena's brother made his cruel wager that spring, when the laughter of Charleston's men echoed off marble and glass, Isaac did not yet know that his name had been chosen as the instrument of someone else's downfall. But something deep within him stirred an instinct honed by years of waiting. He had spent 15 years listening. Now, the time was coming when he would finally be heard. In the weeks following Edmund Whitmore's funeral, Rosemont Plantation changed from a home into a vault filled with ghosts of unpaid debts, false ledgers, and broken promises that seemed to breathe through the paper itself. The mourning draperies still hung in the windows, but the air inside had grown heavy with dust and secrecy. Helena, now 32 and dressed in widow's black that no longer fit her slender frame, moved through the great house like someone trapped between worlds, too proud to beg, too intelligent to pretend ignorance. It began with the letters, dozens of them, delivered by riders from Charleston, Savannah, and New Orleans. Each bore the elegant hand of a creditor or broker, expressing regret that certain financial matters had come to their attention. The first few Helena ignored, assuming confusion that could be straightened out with patience and charm. But when she began opening Edmund's desk drawers, she found the truth waiting in neat, devastating rows. Promissory notes, unpaid bonds, and overlapping mortgages. One for the house itself, another for the fields, and a third for the enslaved people, who were, by law, considered collateral. The numbers didn't add up because they were never meant to. Edmund had been borrowing from one creditor to pay another, spinning illusions of prosperity until his heart failed at his own dining table. Helena spent nights hunched over those ledgers by candlelight, her fingers smudged with ink, her face drawn and pale. She traced each signature, each date, and realized the betrayal was older than she had imagined. For years, her husband had deceived her with gifts, jewelry, silks, imported wines, while pawning away the estate brick by brick. The servants whispered that the mistress was losing her mind. They saw her pacing the halls long after midnight, stopping occasionally to stare at the portraits of her husband and his ancestors, as if expecting one of them to answer for the ruin that had left her. By February of 1834, the wolves were closing in. One creditor, a cotton factor named Johnstone, sent his agent to collect interest she could not pay. The man stood in her drawing room, hat in hand, explaining that if she could not produce $400 by the end of the month, her plantation's next harvest would be seized as payment. When Helena demanded time, he smiled thinly and said, "Time, Mrs. Whitmore, is a commodity even the dead cannot afford." Her brother Marcus offered no sympathy. He wrote from Charleston, gloating that her husband's brilliance had finally proven mortal. "You always fancied yourself the clever one," his letter read, "but cleverness does not grow crops." He knew, of course, that she had inherited Rosemont, but not the cash to sustain it. And when Helena traveled to Charleston in early March to meet with lawyers and factors, Marcus was waiting, eager to play savior to the sister he had secretly despised since childhood. The irony was bitter. Helena had once prided herself on her education, on her ability to read, cipher, and manage affairs better than many men. But the law gave her no power. As a widow, she could not sell property without a male witness. She could not contest a contract her husband had signed. She could only plead, charm, or barter tools that lost their value quickly when creditors smelled blood. Each night in her rented room above Broad Street, she dreamed of Rosemont collapsing into dust, the oak trees dying, the soil turning black. She saw Isaac sometimes in those dreams, his massive silhouette standing in the kitchen doorway, expression unreadable, as if waiting for something. It was absurd, she told herself, a widow dreaming of her cook. But in that strange season between grief and desperation, her thoughts moved in dangerous directions. When she finally entered the Charleston Club that March morning to meet her brother, it was not pride that drove her but exhaustion, the kind that makes a person willing to accept any bargain that promises relief. Marcus mistook her composure for arrogance. He thought he could break her with humiliation. He didn't realize that Helena Whitmore was already broken, and that brokenness, when sharpened by intellect, can become a weapon far more dangerous than rage. As she signed her name beneath the terms of the wager, the ink blotting slightly on the parchment, she knew what the men in that smoke-filled room did not. She had nothing left to lose, and a woman with nothing left to lose is capable of anything. That night, as her carriage rolled back toward Rosemont under a pale moon, Helena looked out at the marshes shimmering beyond the road and thought of Isaac in the kitchen, still silent, still waiting. Somewhere between pity and calculation, an idea began to take shape, a way to turn her brother's cruelty into her salvation. She did not yet know what it would cost, only that it would begin with the man everyone else had overlooked. Marcus Whitmore had always believed cruelty was most effective when wrapped in civility. He drafted the wager himself that night in his townhouse on King Street, his pen scratching over parchment with the calm precision of a man writing an obituary. By the time the ink dried, the document read like a legal instrument, because it was one. It laid out the terms with an elegance that masked the sadism underneath. Helena, it stated, must select a gentleman of unfit origin and station, whom she will, by her own instruction and influence, render suitable for lawful marriage within 6 months' time. Marcus inserted those words, lawful marriage, knowing full well that under South Carolina law, such a union would be nearly impossible if the man were enslaved. The clause was his trap. It gave her just enough room to imagine victory, while ensuring her ruin the moment she tried. The second clause sealed it. If Helena succeeded, Marcus would pay every debt owed by the estate of Edmund Whitmore, including accrued interest, and relinquish all claim to Rosemont Plantation. But if she failed, she would cede all property, holdings, and rights of inheritance to her brother Marcus Whitmore and depart the state of South Carolina, never to return. By dawn, he had summoned 2 witnesses, men who owed him favors, and together they signed and sealed the agreement. The wax bore the Whitmore crest, its twin ravens staring in opposite directions. When Helena returned to Rosemont that evening, she carried the document in her reticule, folded once but already creased at the edges. She locked herself in the library and read it again beneath the flickering lamplight, her eyes tracing each sentence until the meaning cut like a blade. Marcus believed he had trapped her in a spectacle, an impossible performance of refinement and sin, but Helena saw something else buried within the text, a challenge written in the language of law. To win, she would not only have to manipulate society's boundaries, she would have to manipulate the law itself. The idea ignited a strange, cold excitement in her. For years she had watched men conduct the business of the world, as if women existed merely to decorate its margins. Now, for the first time, she had a chance to expose that hypocrisy, to weaponize it. The next morning, she called for her carriage. Her maid, Eliza, found her already dressed in gray silk, her widow's veil pinned precisely. "We're going into town," Helena said. "There are matters of law I wish to understand." Her first stop was the office of an elderly solicitor, Mr. Barrett, who had once handled her husband's accounts. She presented the document without explanation. Barrett adjusted his spectacles and read silently for several minutes before looking up. "I trust this is not genuine, madam?" "It is binding," she replied. "And I intend to honor it." Barrett blinked. "Then forgive my bluntness, Mrs. Whitmore, but your brother has designed your destruction. The law recognizes no marriage between a white woman and an enslaved man." "Between a white woman and a free man of color?" she asked. Barrett hesitated, sensing the trap in her tone. "Such marriages are exceedingly rare and ill-advised. They are not expressly forbidden, but they invite scrutiny, punishment, even violence." Helena leaned forward, her gloved fingers resting on the desk. "Exceedingly rare is not the same as impossible. That afternoon, she sent a note to Marcus, acknowledging receipt of the wager. Her handwriting was neat and deliberate. "Your conditions are clear. I accept them fully. You shall have your answer within 6 months." Marcus received the letter with a laugh that unsettled even his friends. "She's truly lost her senses," he said, but somewhere, deep beneath his amusement, a small unease took root. Helena had always been cleverer than she appeared, and there was something in her tone, something almost surgical in its calm, that made him wonder whether he had misjudged her resolve. At Rosemont, Helena dined alone that night. The house had grown eerily quiet since the funeral, its grand halls echoing with the faint crackle of the hearth. She ate without tasting, her thoughts racing between her husband's debts, her brother's wager, and the man whose name now flickered unspoken in her mind. Isaac. She remembered the stillness of him, the precision with which he moved, the way silence seemed to follow him like a cloak. Marcus had chosen Isaac to humiliate her, but what if that choice could instead destroy him? Helena set down her glass, her reflection wavering in the candlelight. Somewhere in the distance, she heard Isaac's heavy footsteps cross the kitchen floor. The wager had begun. When Marcus Whitmore uttered the name Isaac, the laughter that filled the Charleston Club was thunderous and immediate. The very notion was obscene, a deliberate mockery of the social order that governed every breath in South Carolina society. The men slapped their thighs, wheezed through cigar smoke, and demanded that the wager be written down exactly as stated, so that history could never forget the absurdity of it. Even the servants lingering by the door smothered their grins behind their hands. But Helena did not laugh. She sat perfectly still, her gloved fingers tracing the rim of her glass, her eyes fixed on the mirror behind the bar where Marcus's reflection smiled like the devil himself. "Isaac," Marcus repeated, savoring the shock in the room. "Your cook, is he not? The great silent colossus of Rosemont? I can think of no man less suited to stand beside you. He cannot speak, he cannot read, and I dare say he cannot fit into a wedding coat." The cruelty landed like a slap. Helena had expected mockery, but hearing Isaac's name tossed into that circle of sneering faces twisted something in her chest. For 15 years, the man had lived in the background of her life, present but invisible, reliable but never seen. To them, he was a joke. To her, he was a tool. Yet in that instant, she saw how easily power turned human beings into weapons of humiliation. "You expect me to marry property," she said at last, her tone cold enough to still the laughter. Marcus leaned back, pleased with his performance. "That's precisely the point, dear sister. You wanted a challenge. What greater one than elevating an enslaved man to the dignity of a husband?" "Impossible," someone muttered. "The law would never allow it." Marcus turned toward the speaker with feigned regret. "Ah, but our Helena is resourceful. She might find a loophole. I, for one, would enjoy watching her try." The men roared again. One of them, a judge's son, wagered another bottle of wine that Helena would not last a week before abandoning her farce. Another claimed he'd pay good money to attend the ceremony, should it ever occur. Marcus poured himself another drink, basking in the attention. "Gentlemen," he declared, "we are witnessing history, the undoing of a Whitmore." Helena stood, gathering her shawl. "Then you shall have your history," she said quietly. "But remember, you demanded the spectacle." Her voice carried a finality that unsettled even the most intoxicated among them. She left the club without another word, her heels clicking against the marble floor like hammer blows sealing a coffin. Outside, the night was cool and salt-tinged from the harbor breeze. The city lamps burned low, their light trembling against the cobblestones. As her carriage waited, Helena paused beneath the wrought iron balcony and let the laughter echo behind her one last time. Isaac, the name repeated in her mind, steady as a drumbeat. She had not spoken to him since her husband's death, had scarcely looked at him. Yet now, through no fault of his own, he had become the hinge upon which her ruin and perhaps her salvation would turn. By the time the carriage wheels began rolling toward Rosemont, the plan had already begun forming, half born from fury and half from desperation. To prove Marcus wrong, she would have to make the impossible possible. But first, she needed to understand the boundaries of the trap he'd set. the laws that defined who was man, who was property, and who might cross that fragile line between the two. The road home stretched through marshland, shimmering under moonlight. Somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill called. Helena leaned her head against the window pane and let the rhythm of the wheels steady her thoughts. The men in that club thought her reckless, a desperate widow driven by pride. They would soon learn that desperation, when refined by intellect, was a force of nature. At Rosemont, the kitchen windows still glowed faintly. She could picture Isaac inside, stoking the last embers of the fire, his massive frame bent over the stove. She wondered, had he heard her carriage arrive? Would he look up as she entered? She pushed the thought away. Tomorrow, she decided, she would begin with the law. The day after that with him. By the time Helena ascended the stairs to her room, her hands no longer trembled. She unpinned her veil, extinguished the lamp, and stood before the darkened mirror. The reflection that stared back no longer looked like a grieving widow. It looked like a strategist studying the battlefield. Marcus had given her 6 months, 6 months to defy her brother, the law, and the world itself. And she already knew the first move. For 3 days, Charleston's legal quarter buzzed quietly, with rumor of a widow haunting its offices. She arrived each morning in mourning black, stepped from her carriage without assistance, and carried with her a folded parchment sealed in red wax, the wager that had scandalized the city. Clerks whispered as she passed, for women rarely entered those narrow, musty rooms where the business of men was transacted in dust and Latin. But Helena Whitmore had never been one for permission. Her first visit was to the offices of Caleb Drayton, an aging lawyer whose white hair stood in wild contrast to the ink stains on his cuffs. Drayton had handled the sale of land for her late husband, and he greeted her with polite confusion. "Mrs. Whitmore, I was most grieved to hear of your loss. How may I serve you?" She placed the wager on his desk and waited while he read. His eyebrows rose with each line until, at the end, he exhaled a low whistle. "Your brother is either mad or inspired. This, my dear lady, is not a contract. It is a declaration of war." "I am aware," Helena said evenly. "What I need to know is whether it can be won." Drayton leaned back, studying her. "The law forbids marriage between a white woman and an enslaved man. You know that. Such a union would be invalid and punishable. And if the man were not enslaved?" He blinked, caught off guard. "A free man of color, then? That would be problematic, but not explicitly illegal. There are rare precedents, usually involving foreign-born persons or cases before the Revolution, when the statutes were less defined. So it can be done," she said. Drayton frowned. "You would invite disgrace, Mrs. Whitmore. You'd be shunned, perhaps driven from the state. You'd lose what remains of your standing." "I have already lost everything that can be taken from me," she replied, rising to go. "Now I intend to see how much remains that cannot." By the time she left his office, Drayton was staring after her, as if he'd glimpsed something he couldn't quite name, resolve dressed as madness. The following day, she visited the courthouse archives. The clerks there, amused by her persistence, eventually pointed her toward a forgotten volume of manumission records from the previous century. Within those yellowed pages, she found the faint outline of a path. The law, she learned, drew its harshest line between bondage and freedom. A white woman could not marry an enslaved man, but she could, in theory, marry a free man of color. Such marriages were tolerated when politically convenient, condemned when not, but they were not void by definition. The key lay in the transformation itself, the act of freeing the enslaved person before the marriage took place. That evening, Helena sat by the window of her Charleston boarding room, the sea breeze stirring the curtains, and considered what must come next. To free Isaac, she would need to petition a magistrate, declare her intention publicly, and pay a fee she could scarcely afford. Worse, every man involved in the process, from clerk to judge, would know the name of the man she freed. Charleston would feast on the scandal. Yet beneath the fear was a strange exhilaration. For the first time since Edmund's death, she felt power moving through her, quiet, deliberate, and dangerous. Her brother's wager had not merely insulted her, it had offered her a weapon disguised as humiliation. On the third day, she met with a magistrate named Cornelius Ashford, whose face looked carved from the same stone as the courthouse walls. He listened in chilly silence as she requested the necessary papers. "You understand, Mrs. Whitmore," he said at last, "that freeing a slave is not a gesture to be taken lightly. It invites scrutiny from your neighbors and suspicion from the law." "I understand perfectly," she said. Ashford studied her with something like curiosity. "And you claim this Isaac hasn't earned such reward through faithful service?" "He has earned far more than any of us," she replied. That night, back at Rosemont, Helena sat alone in the library with the manumission papers before her. The candles burned low, their light trembling across the ink. The signatures were still blank. All that remained was to write the name. Outside, through the kitchen window, she could see Isaac's silhouette against the firelight, broad, still, unyielding. The name that had begun as mockery now hung in the air between them like a storm gathering over the fields. She dipped her pen in ink, and for the first time, she wrote it. Isaac, aged approximately 30 years, freed this day by his mistress, Helena Whitmore of Rosemont Plantation, for reasons of faithful service and personal merit. The ink shimmered as it dried, sealing not just a document, but the first step towards something the law itself had never dared imagine. On the morning of March 29, 1834, Helena Whitmore rode into Charleston with the manumission papers folded neatly in her gloved hand. The carriage wheels clattered over the cobblestones of Meeting Street as she rehearsed, in silence, the words she would soon have to speak before the magistrate. It was not fear that quickened her heartbeat, but the sense that she was crossing a line invisible to most, a threshold between the world as it was and the world as it might be if she won. The courthouse stood like a fortress of marble and shadow, its columns catching the pale spring sunlight. Inside, the air smelled of dust, candle smoke, and ink. The clerk who greeted her, a thin young man with hair slicked flat, and the wary politeness reserved for women of rank, looked startled when she presented the folded document. "You wish to file for manumission?" he repeated, as though the word itself might stain his tongue. "Yes," she replied. "For one Isaac, aged approximately 30 years, employed at Rosemont Plantation." The clerk hesitated, glancing toward the open door of the magistrate's chamber. "I must ask your reason, Mrs. Whitmore. The law requires a statement of motive before approval can be granted." Helena smiled faintly. "Then, write this: for reasons of faithful service and the fulfillment of a debt long owed." He blinked, uncertain whether he had heard correctly, but obeyed. Within moments, her petition was entered into the record. When she was finally ushered into the office of Magistrate Cornelius Ashford, she found him exactly as she remembered: gaunt, gray, and severe. His face a landscape of permanent suspicion. He rose only slightly as she entered. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his voice dry as old parchment, "to what do we owe this unexpected civic gesture?" "I have come to free one of my servants, sir," she replied evenly. "A man named Isaac." Ashford's eyes narrowed. "Your cook, is he not? The large fellow who never speaks?" Helena inclined her head. "The same. And you wish to relinquish property of considerable value when it is known your estate faces certain financial strain." His tone was almost amused, but beneath it lay something sharper: curiosity, edged with contempt. "It is my right," she said. "The law allows a mistress to manumit by petition, provided the reasons are declared and the fees paid." "Indeed," he leaned back, steepling his fingers. "And yet, the law also reserves the right to refuse if it deems the action injurious to public interest. We must consider the example such generosity sets. There are those who believe freedom is contagious." Helena met his gaze without flinching. "Then consider this an inoculation, not an infection." The clerk stifled a cough. Ashford's mouth twitched, though whether from irritation or admiration was impossible to tell. After a long pause, he reached for his quill. "Very well. I see no explicit cause to deny it. Have the man brought here before dusk for formal acknowledgement. The papers will be filed tomorrow." Helena curtsied slightly. "You are most efficient, sir." By the time she returned to her carriage, word had already begun to spread. The driver, an old man who'd served the Whitmores for decades, avoided her eyes as he opened the door. "Beg pardon, ma'am," he murmured, "but folks'll talk. They say you're fixing to turn loose one of your own." "I am turning loose no one," she said quietly. "I am setting something right." At Rosemont, the household had gathered in the yard by the time she arrived. The servants stood in uneasy clusters, whispering. They had seen her carriage return from town, had seen the seal on the folded parchment in her hand. Helena stepped down from the carriage and crossed the courtyard to where Isaac stood, motionless as ever, by the kitchen steps. For a moment, neither spoke. The late afternoon light cast their shadows long across the dirt. Then she held out the papers. "These are yours," she said. "You are no longer bound to me or to anyone." Isaac took the document with hands that dwarfed the page. His eyes, dark and unreadable, lifted to meet hers. Around them, the plantation seemed to hold its breath. For 15 years, he had been a figure of silence. Now that silence deepened into something almost holy. Helena waited for some reaction, a smile, a word, even disbelief, but none came. He merely folded the papers once, precisely, and said nothing. It was only when she turned to walk away that she heard his voice for the first time in 16 years. "Why now?" She froze. The voice was deep, measured, and unnervingly calm, neither grateful nor angry, merely awake. When she looked back, Isaac's expression had not changed, but the question hung between them like a blade. Helena did not answer. She could not, because the truth was something even she had not yet dared to name. The rain had begun before dawn, drumming softly on the tin roof of the carriage house and soaking the magnolia trees that lined the rear courtyard. Helena sat in her library, staring at the manumission papers spread open on the desk, the ink of her signature faintly blurred from the damp. Isaac's name stood out in her handwriting like an accusation. It was done irrevocable, recorded, sealed in the county ledger. He was no longer her property, and yet, the knowledge brought her no peace. When she had freed him the day before, she had expected something: gratitude, confusion, even resentment. But instead, there had been that silence, vast and impenetrable. Only later, as she left the courtyard, had his voice emerged from it like a ghost surfacing from deep water. "Why now?" Those two words had followed her through the night, echoing against the walls of her mind. Now, as dawn crept pale and uncertain through the rain, Helena sent a servant to summon Isaac to the library. She rehearsed what she might say, how she might explain that his freedom was the first step in something larger, a plan that could save them both. But when she heard his heavy footsteps approach, her practiced calm faltered. He entered without hesitation. The doorway barely contained him. In the soft gray light, his features seemed newly defined, no longer the blurred outline of a servant, but a man with presence, with gravity. Water clung to his shoulders, beating on his coarse linen shirt. "Sit," Helena said, gesturing toward the chair opposite her desk. He did not move. "You are free now," she began, forcing steadiness into her tone. "You may remain here in my employ, or you may leave. No one will compel you either way." Still, he said nothing. His gaze was fixed not on her, but on the papers lying before her, as though reading them for the first time. "Do you understand?" she pressed. "You are free." He looked up at last, and the calm in his eyes unnerved her. "I understand words," he said. His voice was unlike anything she had imagined. Low, deliberate, each syllable shaped with care, like a man unused to hearing himself aloud. "What I do not understand is intent." Helena frowned. "Intent? I was purchased. I was owned. I was silent because silence is safe. Now you unmake that with ink and say I am free. But what does free mean in a place where a man's worth is still counted in cotton?" His question struck her, like a confession of guilt she hadn't realized she carried. "It means you may choose for yourself," she said softly. He stepped closer to the desk, and for the first time, she saw intelligence, not the quiet obedience of a servant, but something sharper, older, waiting. "I had a choice, once," he said, 15 years ago, before your husband's overseer brought me here. I chose silence then. It kept me alive. Helena swallowed. You can speak as you wish now. He studied her a moment longer before answering. Then I will speak plainly. I have been waiting 16 years for you to need me more than I need you. The words hung in the room like thunder waiting to break. Helena's breath caught. There was no defiance in his tone, no threat, only truth. A truth that shifted the balance of everything between them. You misunderstand, she managed at last. This is not charity, it is a partnership. Isaac's mouth curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. Partnership requires equality. We will see if Charleston agrees with you. He turned to leave, but paused in the doorway. You asked me once to bring you water during a storm, he said without looking back. You said you feared thunder. Do you remember what I told you then? She hesitated. No. You said, speak, so I will know you hear me. But I never spoke. Now, I have. Then he was gone, leaving the door open behind him, the sound of rain rushing in through the hall. Helena sat frozen, her pulse thrumming in her ears. She had freed him to win a wager to turn her brother's cruelty into her triumph. But in that brief exchange, she had glimpsed something terrifying. Isaac's silence had not been submission, it had been patience. And now that patience had ended, the morning after Isaac's first words, Rosemont Plantation seemed to breathe differently. Servants who once passed him with casual orders now stepped aside in silence, unsure whether to call him Mr. or say nothing at all. The rhythm of the household, so long dictated by unspoken rules, had shifted by a fraction, and everyone felt it. Even the air in the kitchen, heavy with the smell of yeast and ash, seemed charged with an unease that no one could name. Helena, for her part, spent the day locked in the library, with the rain still whispering against the shutters. Isaac's words, "You need me more than I need you," had rearranged the ground beneath her feet. She told herself it was pride that stung, not fear. Pride that a man she had freed could speak to her with such calm authority, as though the act of freedom had also reversed gravity itself. But when she looked honestly at her reflection in the glass, she saw something closer to fascination. By evening, she made a decision. If the wager was to be won, she could not merely free Isaac. She would have to transform him into someone who could withstand the judgment of Charleston's most poisonous tongues. That meant education, manners, poise, the invisible armor of the world she inhabited. She found him in the garden behind the kitchen house, repairing a section of the fence that had collapsed in the storm. His hands moved with practiced precision, every motion deliberate. When she approached, he did not turn. "I've arranged a schedule," she said. "There are books in the library, histories, etiquette manuals, Bibles. You will study them daily." He lifted the fence post into place and spoke without looking at her. "You believe I cannot read?" Helena paused. "Can you?" Now he turned, slowly. "I could read before I came here. I learned in Dr. Thorne's house, before he sold me to your husband." Dr. Thorne. The name rang a distant bell, an eccentric physician who had once been whispered about for his abolitionist sympathies. It struck her that Isaac's silence, his unassuming nature, had not been ignorance but concealment. "You've hidden that all these years?" she asked. He nodded. "A man who reads too much and speaks too little draws attention. I have learned that attention is dangerous." Helena's composure faltered. "Then perhaps we begin not with letters, but with refinement. You will dine in the main house. You'll learn to speak properly, to move among others as an equal." Isaac leaned against the fence post, rainwater dripping from the brim of his hat. "You think civility is a costume," he said. "That if I learn your language, your posture, your table manners, I might pass for something else. But tell me, who are we trying to convince? Your brother or yourself?" Helena stiffened. "I'm trying to save Rosemont." "No," he said quietly. "You're trying to save Helena Whitmore." She turned sharply, as if struck. For a moment she saw herself through his eyes, a woman dressed in mourning silk, bargaining with her pride to mask her desperation. Then Isaac bent again to his work, as if the conversation were over. That night, he appeared at the library door, without being summoned. "You said I must learn," he said, stepping inside. "Then teach me as you would a man, not a servant." Helena gestured to a chair. "Sit." He did, his massive frame dwarfing the delicate furniture. She placed a book before him, a copy of The Moral Sentiments by Adam Smith, and began to read aloud. To her surprise, Isaac followed every word, interrupting once to correct her pronunciation of a Latin phrase. Hours passed unnoticed. The fire burned low. When at last she closed the book, Helena realized her hands were trembling not from exhaustion, but from something more dangerous. Isaac had not only absorbed the words, he had challenged them, questioned them, reshaped them. As he rose to leave, she heard herself say, "Tomorrow we begin again." He nodded once. "Tomorrow." Then, after he left, Helena stared at the open book on the table. The wager had been conceived as humiliation, but it was becoming something else, entirely a quiet duel between two people, neither willing to lose. Outside, the wind shifted over the marshes, carrying with it the faint smell of the sea and the promise of another storm. The first whispers began on King Street, carried between milliners and merchants before reaching the parlors of Broad and Bay. At first, the story sounded too absurd to be believed. Mrs. Helena Whitmore, widow of Edmund Whitmore, had freed her enslaved cook. That alone was scandal enough. But by the time the rumor reached the tea tables of the city's elite, the tale had evolved into something more salacious, that she had not only freed the man, but was teaching him to read, dine, and dress as a gentleman. By the end of the week, Charleston's gossip circuits burned hotter than summer tar. In the parlors of Meeting Street, ladies fanned themselves furiously while speculating whether grief had driven Helena to madness. In the smoking rooms of the Charleston Club, where Marcus Whitmore reigned amid brandy and smirks, the laughter was merciless. "Can you imagine it?" drawled Colonel Green, a man whose fortune was built on human flesh. That mute ox in a dinner coat sitting at her table, as if he belonged there. Marcus smiled thinly. Helena was always fond of impossible causes. Perhaps she thinks God will mistake scandal for salvation. Another planter chuckled. "I hear she's dining with him nightly, alone. Imagine the talk when he forgets himself and takes her hand across the table." Marcus raised his glass. "Gentlemen, let us drink to my sister's ruin. She will give Charleston the finest tragedy it's had since the fire of '24. Across the city, in quieter quarters, the free black community watched the unfolding spectacle with wary fascination. In the markets, laundresses whispered to one another, trading fragments of rumor. Some said Helena Whitmore was planning to marry Isaac outright. Others swore she'd gone mad from loneliness. A few, mostly the younger ones, dared to hope there was truth in the story, that someone of her standing might defy the law's cruel arithmetic. At Rosemont, Helena began to feel the weight of that invisible storm. Letters arrived daily, some anonymous, others written by women she had once called friends. They came disguised as concern but carried venom between the lines. "Dearest Helena," one began, "we pray you are not allowing sentiment to cloud your good judgment. Charleston speaks of nothing else. Remember your station, my dear. There are limits, even to sympathy." Another, unsigned, was blunt. "If you intend to shame your family, at least do it quietly." She burned each letter in the fireplace, unread beyond the first line. Yet the smell of scorched paper lingered like accusation. When she finally ventured into town to purchase supplies, conversation stopped as she entered the shops. Women who had once kissed her cheek now greeted her with polite frost. Even the grocer's apprentice, who had served her family for years, averted his eyes when she spoke. That evening, she found Isaac in the parlor reading aloud from the Federalist papers, his voice steady, his diction almost formal. "You speak as if you were born to it," she said, attempting to sound detached. He glanced up, unreadable. "Words belong to no one. They only require understanding." She forced a smile. "Then Charleston should fear you." "I think it already does," he replied, closing the book. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the harbor. The storm that had begun as laughter was gathering into something darker. Marcus had begun to act in earnest. He sent word to Reverend Whitfield, the minister who had baptized Helena years before, warning him that her spiritual state had become alarming. He called in favors from lawyers and magistrates, probing for legal grounds to challenge the manumission. Within weeks, Helena found her accounts frozen by a creditor she'd never met. Deliveries ceased. Workers began deserting the fields, spooked by the rumors that Rosemont was cursed. And yet, in the midst of that unraveling, the lessons continued. Each evening, Isaac sat across from her, learning the nuances of conversation, posture, and the world that had once been closed to him. But it was Helena, not Isaac, who was changing most. She began to see her own reflection in the scandal, a woman who had lived her whole life by the rules of men now punished for breaking them. When she retired that night, she paused at the window overlooking the darkened fields. Lanterns flickered near the slave quarters like scattered stars. Somewhere out there, Charleston's whispers were crawling toward her gates. Helena drew the curtains shut. Let them whisper, she thought. By the time they stopped, the city would remember her name forever. By the first week of May, the transformation had begun, not the kind seen in storybooks, but the quiet, unsettling sort that made people question what they were seeing. Rosemont's servants, who once treated Isaac with casual authority, now hesitated before speaking his name. He moved through the house with a deliberate grace that unsettled even the overseer. His silence, once taken for dullness, had become something weightier, a silence that made others measure their words carefully. Helena watched it happen with a fascination that frightened her. She had imagined the process would be mechanical. Lessons, posture, language, the slow grafting of refinement onto a rough exterior. But Isaac was not a man being shaped. He was a man revealing what had been hidden all along. Each day he seemed to discard another layer of invisibility. It began with how he carried himself. Where once he had stooped to appear smaller in rooms dominated by white faces, now he stood upright, shoulders square, gaze steady. The change was subtle at first, but the effect was undeniable. Helena noticed that when he entered a room, conversation paused, not because of his race or his size, but because he commanded the space as if it had always belonged to him. She also noticed how easily he absorbed knowledge. When she handed him a book on philosophy, he read it within a night. When she corrected his diction, he adopted her accent within hours, speaking with a calm precision that carried more authority than charm. Even his handwriting, strong, measured, elegant, startled her the first time she saw it. It was the script of an educated man, not of someone who had lived 15 years in bondage. One evening, Helena arranged a dinner in the main hall, not a grand affair, but an experiment. The long table was set with silver and crystal, as it had been in Edmund's time, though the seats around it were empty save for two. Isaac arrived dressed in a dark wool coat and a linen waistcoat tailored for him by Charlotte Desmond, the free woman of color who had quietly agreed to assist Helena. The coat fit perfectly, its clean lines emphasizing rather than concealing his size. For a moment, Helena almost forgot the wager, the debts, the ruin hanging over her. She saw only the man standing before her, dignified and still, framed by candlelight. "You look," she said softly, "like someone the world might mistake for a gentleman." Isaac's eyes met hers. "A gentleman is a fiction," he said. "A performance others agree to believe." She smiled faintly. "Then perform it well. The audience will be unforgiving." They ate in near silence, broken only by the soft chime of silver against porcelain. Helena found herself aware of small things she had never noticed before. The steadiness of his hands, the ease with which he handled each utensil, the measured pace of his breathing. At last, she set down her glass. "You must understand," she said, "this wager was not made for cruelty's sake." "No," he said quietly. "It was made for survival's sake. Yours." The bluntness of it struck her harder than accusation. She looked at him across the table, searching for mockery, but found none. Only truth, calmly delivered. "I thought," she said slowly, "that freedom might make you grateful." Isaac tilted his head, considering. "Freedom is not a gift, Mrs. Whitmore. It is a return. What you gave was permission for me to stop pretending." Helena's breath caught. There was no arrogance in his words, only an honesty that left her exposed. She realized then that she had not created a pupil or a partner. She had released something neither of them fully understood. Outside, a summer storm gathered over the marshes. Thunder rolled faintly in the distance, echoing through the open windows. Helena rose from the table, her heartbeat quickening. "You should rest," she said. Isaac stood as well. "And you should decide whether you are teaching me or testing yourself." The lightning illuminated his face for an instant, calm, unreadable, utterly self-possessed, and Helena felt an inexplicable shiver run through her. As he left the hall, she realized the wager no longer belonged to her. It had shifted, quietly, into his hands. By early June, the air in Charleston had turned thick with heat and gossip, and both clung to Rosemont like a second skin. Carriages that once rolled up Helena's drive now turned away at the gate. The merchants who had supplied her household for years sent polite refusals or no response at all. In the city, her name had become shorthand for ruin, spoken in whispers among the devout and with smirking curiosity among the idle. But while Charleston shut its doors, others began to open theirs quietly. Not all believed the world was as fixed as Marcus Whitmore insisted it was. Beneath the city's polished veneer, there existed a small network of dissenters, Quakers, free people of color, and a handful of northern transplants whose moral convictions placed them perpetually at odds with polite society. To them, Helena's defiance was not madness, but courage. It was through one such friend, a widow named Lydia Hartwell, that Helena found her way to a small Quaker meeting house on Pitt Street. The place smelled of cedar and old paper. No pews, no altar, only benches facing one another in a circle. There she met Thomas and Miriam Evans, a husband and wife recently arrived from Pennsylvania, whose calm, measured speech carried none of the venom Charleston tongues were accustomed to. "We have heard," Miriam said gently, "that you are attempting something dangerous." Helena hesitated. "Perhaps, but not wrong." Thomas nodded. "Those two are rarely the same thing in this city." He glanced toward Isaac, who stood silently at her side. "You intend to educate him?" "More than that," Helena said. "I intend to make the law itself acknowledge what the world denies." For a long moment, the room was silent, but for the creak of floorboards. Then Miriam spoke. "There are books here, and people willing to teach, but you must understand, Mrs. Whitmore, what you ask is not simply instruction, it is rebellion." Helena met her gaze. "Then let it be that." From that day, Isaac began attending lessons at the meeting house twice each week, traveling at dusk to avoid unwanted eyes. There, he learned to refine what he already knew, to write letters in the formal style of gentlemen, to calculate ledgers, to debate scripture and philosophy. The Quakers, cautious but curious, treated him with the same quiet respect they offered everyone. Yet even among them, there was a tension, as if they knew they were helping to build something that could not be hidden forever. Another ally emerged from Charleston's colored district, Charlotte Desmond, the free woman who had sewn Isaac's suit. She owned a dressmaking shop near the waterfront, catering to both white ladies and women of color who could afford her craft. She was beautiful in the restrained, weary way of those who had long learned to navigate two worlds. "I've seen men try to climb higher than the law allows," she told Helena one evening while fitting her for a gown. "Most fall hard, but if you mean to succeed, you'll need more than education. You'll need allies who know how to move quietly." "Then you'll help us?" Helena asked. Charlotte smiled faintly. "You've already made enemies enough for 10 women. Someone ought to balance the scales." Through Charlotte's connections, Isaac gained access to a small library above her shop, a gathering place for free black artisans who shared books smuggled from the north. There, he began to read works Helena had never dared open: abolitionist tracts, political essays, and the writings of men who spoke openly of freedom not as permission but as birthright. At Rosemont, Helena began receiving coded letters, lists of contacts, lawyers sympathetic to reform, ministers who might, under the right circumstances, bless an unconventional union. Each letter ended the same way: "Tell no one. Trust only those who live in the shadows." She burned each one after reading, but their words stayed with her. And so, a strange dual life emerged. By day, Rosemont appeared a house in decline, a widow and her freed servant clinging to respectability. But by night, it became something else entirely. A quiet workshop of treasonous hope. In the library, under flickering candlelight, Helena and Isaac rehearsed conversation, debated philosophy, and drafted letters to distant allies. One evening, after reading a passage aloud, Helena looked up to find Isaac watching her. "You're risking more than your fortune," he said softly. "You're risking your name." "I've worn that name like a chain for 10 years, she replied. "It's time it served me instead of the other way around." He nodded, thoughtful. "Then we'll need silence, until the day comes to speak loudly." Outside, the cicadas began their chorus. Inside, between them, an understanding formed, wordless but absolute. The conspiracy of silence had begun. By late June, Marcus Whitmore's confidence had curdled into unease. For weeks, he had treated his sister's wager as a farce, a family scandal to be enjoyed over brandy and laughter. Yet rumors filtering up from Rosemont began to take on a different shape, less comic, more troubling. The reports were inconsistent but persistent. Helena hosting private dinners, Isaac walking beside her through the gardens, letters carried by strange couriers after dusk, and most disturbing of all, whispers that she was gaining allies in places respectable society preferred not to look. Marcus received the first credible account from a plantation overseer loyal to him, a man named Garrity. The letter arrived sealed in wax, smelling faintly of tobacco and sweat. "Sir, the widow has taken to visiting the colored district in town, always at night, with her man Isaac beside her. The Quakers have been seen in her company. They say she means to marry him proper. Sir, you asked for word if the impossible became possible. Well, it seems the impossible is on her doorstep." Marcus read the letter twice, the second time slower, then crumpled it in his fist. He felt the slow heat of humiliation rise up his neck. It wasn't just that Helena was defying him, it was that she was succeeding. He had set the wager to destroy her, to expose her arrogance, and have Rosemont signed over without a fight. But somehow she had turned his trap into a stage, and now Charleston's elite waited to see how the performance would end. He began making inquiries of his own. One afternoon, he called on Magistrate Cornelius Ashford, under the pretense of discussing trade permits. After the pleasantries, he leaned forward and said, "I hear my sister recently petitioned you for a manumission. You approved it, I believe?" Ashford's pale eyes flickered. "The matter was legal, Mr. Whitmore. The individual met the conditions of faithful service." Marcus smiled thinly. "Yes, I imagine he did. You realize, of course, what she intends to do next." Ashford shifted uneasily. "Intent is not my concern, only the law as written." "That is precisely what concerns me," Marcus said. "I have no wish to see Charleston's name dragged through northern newspapers as a city where white women marry their servants. The law may permit such madness, but surely you and I know the difference between what is legal and what is tolerable." The magistrate did not reply, but Marcus saw the hesitation he'd hoped for. That was enough. Influence, he knew, was rarely exercised through threats. It was planted quietly, like rot in the foundations. That evening, Marcus began to call in favors from old acquaintances. A banker who held one of Edmund Whitmore's loans, a minister who owed him discreet silence over an affair, a judge whose campaign he had financed. He painted Helena's actions not as personal folly but as social contagion. If she succeeds, he told them, every rule that keeps order in this colony will be questioned. She means to undo the line between mistress and slave, black and white, master and property. If the law cannot stop her, perhaps reputation will. Within days, his efforts bore fruit. Merchants began refusing Helena's credit outright. A preacher in town denounced the devil's seductions dressed as charity. Even the local paper printed a veiled commentary about a certain widow whose grief had turned to unholy ambition. At Rosemont, Helena noticed the effects almost immediately. Deliveries stopped arriving. The blacksmith who had always repaired her carriages claimed to be too busy. When she rode into town, she saw acquaintances turn down side streets to avoid greeting her. She suspected Marcus's hand in it, but refused to yield. "He underestimates shame," she told Isaac. "He thinks it will silence me. It will only sharpen my voice." Isaac, ever calm, replied, "Then he will turn to fear next. Men like your brother always do." That night, under the flickering lamplight of his study, Marcus stared at the torn remnants of Garrity's letter and poured himself another glass of brandy. The wager that had once delighted him now felt like a noose tightening around his own neck. His friends still laughed, but he no longer joined them. In private, he wrote to an ally on the city council, a man accustomed to quiet coercion. "We must act before she makes a spectacle of us all. Stop her marriage, whatever means it requires. I will not see my name dragged through the mud by a woman drunk on her own pride." He sealed the letter and sat back, exhausted. Outside, thunder rolled over the harbor, distant but growing closer. Marcus Whitmore, who had once thought himself the author of his sister's downfall, was beginning to realize he had written himself into a story he could no longer control. Reverend Thomas Whitfield was a man of principle and of fear. For 12 years, he had led the African Methodist Episcopal congregation on Boundary Street, preaching humility by day and survival by night. His church was small, its pews hand-carved by its own members, its windows thin enough for voices outside to be heard within. He had baptized infants, buried fathers, married couples whose unions were never legally recognized, and prayed over those whipped within sight of his chapel door. But nothing in his years of quiet ministry had prepared him for the moment Helena Whitmore appeared at his threshold, veiled, unannounced, and unafraid. It was a Wednesday afternoon, the air thick with summer heat. Reverend Whitfield was writing a sermon on forgiveness when his assistant burst into the room, breathless. "There's a white lady here to see you, Reverend. Says her name's Mrs. Whitmore." The name alone sent a chill through him. He knew the stories every pastor in Charleston did. The widow who had freed her slave. The widow who dined with him, educated him, perhaps even loved him. The woman whose scandal had already drawn the attention of city officials eager to make an example. He hesitated, then nodded. "Show her in." Helena entered with the composure of someone used to being watched. She removed her gloves carefully, placing them on the pew beside her, and met his gaze. "Reverend, I come not for salvation, but for ceremony," she said. Whitfield's stomach tightened. "Ceremony? I intend to marry," she said simply. "And I wish you to perform the service." He set down his pen. "Mrs. Whitmore, I must speak plainly. The man you intend to marry, is it true he was once enslaved to you?" "Yes," she said. "He is now free, by lawful act of manumission." Whitfield rose slowly from his desk, the boards creaking beneath his boots. "Then, you understand the danger of what you ask. Such a union, though not forbidden by the letter of the law, will provoke outrage. My congregation already lives on the knife's edge of white tolerance. If I officiate, it will not be me alone who pays the price. They will burn this church." Helena's expression did not waver. "Then they burn a church, but perhaps something stronger will rise from its ashes." Whitfield turned away, pacing. "You speak like a reformer, but reformers do not bury their congregations. I have mouths to feed, families to protect. I know what it is to protect something fragile," she said quietly. "But I also know the cost of silence. My husband's debts were born of deception. My brother's cruelty is fed by cowardice. I will not live another day by either." Her words hung in the air, steady and unnervingly calm. For a long while, the only sound was the soft hum of cicadas outside. At last, Whitfield spoke again. "Do you love him?" Helena blinked, startled by the question. "This is not about love, it is about freedom." He studied her, seeing through the words to the tremor beneath. "I think perhaps it is about both." She said nothing. Finally, he sat again and folded his hands. "If I agree, it must be done quietly. At night, witnesses few and trusted. The papers must be in order, his freedom certified. Your debts cleared enough to prove no coercion. The city will look for any excuse to void the act. They will find none," she said. "Then I will do it," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not because I am unafraid, but because I am tired of fearing the same thing every day." Helena exhaled slowly, the faintest trace of relief softening her shoulders. "Thank you, Reverend." When she had gone, Whitfield sat alone in the silence she left behind. He stared at the cross hanging above the pulpit, the wood darkened by years of smoke and prayer. He had always believed faith was a matter of endurance, of surviving until justice arrived in God's time. But now, for the first time, he wondered whether faith demanded something else action, even when the world would call it blasphemy. That night, he prayed not for forgiveness, but for courage, for he knew that when the sun next rose over Charleston, he would no longer be the cautious shepherd of a trembling flock. He would be a conspirator in a revolution disguised as a wedding. September 11th, 1834, arrived heavy with heat and silence. The air over Rosemont hung still, the cicadas exhausted from their own song. Inside the great house, candles burned low, though the sun had not yet set, as if the light itself feared to intrude. The room smelled faintly of wax, old paper, and something unnameable anticipation, perhaps, or dread. Helena sat in the library, the same room where 6 months earlier she had signed away her future on a wager. The desk where she'd written Isaac's manumission still bore a faint stain from the ink that had sealed both their fates. She had not slept the night before, nor the one before that. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw Charleston's faces, the shock, the laughter, the condemnation, and beneath them all, her brother's smile. She told herself she was not afraid, but fear had a scent, and she could taste it at the back of her throat. Isaac entered without knocking. He had long since stopped waiting for permission. The suit Charlotte Desmond had made for him fit perfectly, the gray wool cut with precision that disguised his size, turning strength into formality. His hair was neatly trimmed, his hands clean, though a faint trace of flour still lingered beneath his nails. For a long moment, neither spoke. The distance between them felt weighted, filled with everything they had said and everything they had not. "You should rest," Helena said finally. "Tomorrow will not rest," he interrupted gently. She looked up at him, startled by the softness in his tone. "Do you have doubts?" Isaac moved closer, stopping at the edge of the firelight. "Doubt and certainty share the same bed. I know what tomorrow means for you, for both of us. You will lose what remains of your place in this world." "That place was never mine," she replied. "It belonged to my husband, to my brother, to every man who claimed to speak for me. I am simply taking back what was stolen. And if they take it from you again," she gave a faint, brittle laugh, "then they will learn that I do not surrender quietly." He studied her face for a long time, the flickering firelight softening the lines around her eyes. "You have courage," he said finally. "But courage, without truth, is only defiance. I need to know, why did you free me?" Helena hesitated. "At first, for the wager, for pride. I wanted to prove Marcus wrong, to win back Rosemont. But that was before you spoke, before I understood what freedom actually costs. And now, she said quietly, I think I freed you because I needed someone who could look at me and see the truth, not the performance." Isaac was silent for a moment. Then he said, "And the truth? That I am not righteous," she whispered, "only desperate." He nodded once, as though confirming something he had long suspected. "Desperation built this country," he said. "Perhaps it will free it too." The clock in the hall struck 9. The sound echoed through the quiet house. Tomorrow, at noon, they would stand before Reverend Whitfield in his small church on Boundary Street. The witnesses, Charlotte Desmond, the Evanses from the Quaker Meeting House, and one freedman from Whitfield's congregation, had sworn secrecy. The law would not protect them, so they would rely instead on silence. Helena rose from her chair. "You should go," she said softly. "If anyone sees us together tonight, they will have all the excuse they need to stop us." Isaac inclined his head. "They will stop us anyway, but I will be there." He turned to leave, but paused at the doorway. "You told me once that freedom is a choice," he said. "Tomorrow, you'll choose it for yourself. I only hope you understand what you're giving away." When he was gone, Helena stood alone before the fire until the candles guttered out. Outside, lightning flickered far off over the marshes, tracing veins of silver across the horizon. She thought of Marcus, of the club where the wager had been made, of the laughter that had sealed her doom. Then she closed her eyes and whispered, almost to herself, "Let them laugh again tomorrow if they dare." Somewhere in the darkness, thunder rolled, and the night held its breath. Morning broke on September 12, 1834, with a strange, golden stillness. The storm that had rumbled through the night had passed, leaving behind air that smelled of wet soil and magnolia. Charleston's streets glistened faintly, washed clean of dust but not of gossip. In a quiet quarter on Boundary Street, within the modest brick chapel of Reverend Thomas Whitfield, preparations were being made for a ceremony that defied both scripture and law, or at least the men who claimed to interpret them. Helena arrived first, wrapped in a gray silk gown whose color hovered between mourning and defiance. She wore no jewels, no lace, only a simple bonnet that cast a shadow over her eyes. Beside her walked Charlotte Desmond, elegant even in her restraint, carrying a small bundle of lilies and rosemary. Reverend Whitfield waited at the altar, his face drawn, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the Bible on the lectern. "Is it wise to begin so soon?" Charlotte whispered. "It will never be wise," Helena replied, her voice steady, "but it will be done." Moments later, Isaac appeared in the doorway. He filled it completely, his broad frame silhouetted against the morning light. He wore the dark suit Charlotte had tailored for him, its seams hand-stitched to balance strength with dignity. For the first time, he seemed neither servant nor spectacle, but something in between, an uncharted figure, walking the thin border between the world that was and the one that ought to be. The guests, no more than 20, rose as he entered. Among them were Thomas and Miriam Evans from the Quaker Meeting House, a few members of Whitfield's congregation, and 2 free men of color who had agreed to witness the union, though their faces carried the caution of men aware that history might crush them for it. Helena turned to face Isaac, and for a heartbeat the chapel fell utterly silent. The sound of the city, distant carts, gulls over the harbor, the rhythm of Charleston itself seemed to pause. Reverend Whitfield cleared his throat. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the sight of God to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony, a covenant not to be entered into lightly, but with reverence and solemn purpose." His voice faltered briefly as his gaze moved between them. White widow, freedman, symbols of everything the city forbade yet could not look away from. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said gently, "do you come of your own will?" "I do," Helena answered. "And you, Isaac?" "I do," came the reply, firm, resonant, calm. Whitfield drew a breath. "Then, by the authority vested in me by the Church and by God above all earthly law, I pronounce you husband and wife." For a long moment, no one moved. Then, Helena reached for Isaac's hand. His fingers, rough and scarred from years of work, closed over hers. There was no kiss, no flourish of joy, only a silence thick with awe and danger. Charlotte's eyes shone with tears. The Evanses bowed their heads in prayer. Reverend Whitfield, voice unsteady, offered a final blessing. "May what God has joined together confound the world that would tear it apart." Outside, the city bells began to ring the noon hour. Their sound, drifting through the chapel's open windows, mingled with the rustle of the congregation rising from their seats. For the briefest instant, it felt as though the world had accepted what it could not comprehend. But that illusion shattered as quickly as it formed. From somewhere down the street came the sharp rhythm of hoofbeats too many for coincidence. Charlotte glanced toward the door. "They know," she whispered. Helena turned to Whitfield, who had gone pale. "Go," he urged. "Now. Through the rear gate, the marsh road will hide you." Isaac took Helena's hand again, steady and deliberate. "We walk together," he said. They slipped out through the chapel's back garden as the hoofbeats grew louder. Behind them, the bells of Charleston continued to toll, their sound neither triumphant nor mournful, only inevitable. And thus, in a city built on chains and debts, a single union had been spoken into existence. For an hour, for a day, or for eternity, it did not matter. The vow had been made. By sunrise the following morning, Charleston knew. The news moved faster than the tide carried by servants, coachmen, and clerks who whispered the words as though saying them aloud might summon fire from the heavens. Helena Whitmore has married her Negro cook. It was repeated with disbelief, then with fury, until by afternoon it had become a kind of public ritual. Every drawing room, every counting house, every market stall had to say the sentence at least once before evening, if only to prove they had heard it. By noon, the social order trembled not from rebellion, but from scandal. At the Charleston Club, where the wager had first been struck, Marcus Whitmore stood before the very men who had witnessed it, his face pale and tight as a noose. Colonel Green slammed his fist on the table. "She's made us all the subject of ridicule. You'll never recover from this, Marcus." "I will recover when she's undone," Marcus replied coldly, "and she will be undone. The law may have failed, but society will not." It did not take long for society to act. By evening, the first refusals arrived at Rosemont. A letter from the bank, formal, unsigned, declared the immediate acceleration of Edmund Whitmore's debts, citing moral insolvency. The factor who managed her cotton exports informed her that his firm could no longer represent a household that had lost public confidence. Merchants closed their ledgers to her name. The grocer sent her deliveries back down the road without explanation. The humiliation was methodical, clean, and complete. Inside the house, Helena read the notices one by one, her face a study in stillness. The servants hovered near the doorways, afraid to meet her eyes. By the third letter, she stopped reading aloud. When she reached the last, an unsigned note that read only, "Leave now," or "Be made to," she folded it carefully and placed it in the fire. Isaac stood at her side, saying nothing. At dusk, a carriage approached the gate, its wheels crunching over the gravel. It bore Marcus's crest. The driver remained seated, while Marcus himself emerged, dressed impeccably, as though attending a funeral. He did not knock. He walked straight through the open door of Rosemont, the familiarity of ownership in his stride. Helena met him in the parlor. "You might have sent another letter," she said. "I prefer the dignity of speech," he replied. "You've left me no other choice." "You've had too many choices," she said. "That's the problem." Marcus ignored her. "Do you know what they're saying in town? They call you mad, a corrupter of your own race. They call him—" She cut him off sharply. "Do not finish that sentence." Marcus stepped closer, lowering his voice. "If you annul this mockery, I can still protect you. I can have the debt forgiven, the scandal contained. You can leave quietly Europe, perhaps, and live comfortably. But if you persist—" Helena smiled faintly, the expression cold and weary. "If I persist, I will have done one honest thing in my life." Marcus's face darkened. "You've destroyed our name." "Our name was never clean," she said. "You only thought the dirt was hidden well enough." They stood there in silence for a moment, the brother and sister who had once shared a childhood home, now divided by something deeper than pride. Outside, the sound of distant thunder echoed over the marshes, though the sky remained dry. Marcus finally spoke. "You've left me no choice. You think this marriage will stand? It won't. I will see it struck from the record." When he turned to leave, Isaac appeared in the doorway, blocking his path. The look between them was wordless, charged. For the first time, Marcus saw not the silent servant he remembered, but the man who had replaced him in power, in meaning, in history. He stepped aside without a word and walked out into the twilight. By nightfall, Charleston's verdict was complete. Helena Whitmore was excommunicated from polite society. Her brother was humiliated but determined, and the city, terrified of what her defiance represented, began to close ranks. The next morning, a sign appeared nailed to Rosemont's gate. In black paint, someone had written one word: "Sinners." Helena tore it down herself, splinters catching in her hands, and whispered to Isaac, "Then, let us sin loudly." For several days after Marcus's visit, Rosemont stood eerily quiet. The house had emptied of visitors, servants, and comfort, yet the silence was not defeat, it was calculation. Helena had spent the past week locked in the study that once belonged to her husband. The curtains drawn, papers spread across the desk like the remnants of a storm. Isaac found her there each morning, still in the same dress as the night before, her hands blackened with ink. She was not mourning, She was working. When he asked what she was doing, she gestured toward the open ledgers and said, "Undoing the lies of a dead man." What began as survival had become revelation. Edmund Whitmore's estate, so long praised for its order and wealth, was a labyrinth of deceit. He had borrowed money under false names, mortgaged the same land to multiple creditors, and even forged signatures from his own employees. The plantation's supposed prosperity had been little more than a stage set carefully painted for Charleston's approval. Isaac listened as she explained, her voice low and steady. Every note he ever signed, every bond he built them on false claims. If I can prove that, those debts die with him. The law will not save me, but it might devour the men who helped him cheat. You mean your brother, Isaac said. She looked up from the ledger. Marcus was part of it, I'm certain now. He kept my husband's accounts, handled the transfers, concealed what was owed. His wager wasn't just cruelty, it was protection. If I had failed, Rosemont would be his again, and the evidence with it. Isaac moved closer, scanning the columns of figures and faded seals. You intend to expose him? Expose all of them, she said. The bankers, the planters, the magistrates, every man who fattened himself on the illusion of our wealth. I won't hang for a marriage if they all drown in their corruption first. There was admiration in Isaac's eyes, but also warning. You're striking at a system that feeds itself on silence. They will not let you speak. Helena smiled faintly. Then I will let the paper speak instead. That afternoon, she showed him the locked drawer beneath the desk. Inside lay a bundle of old letters tied with twine, their edges yellowed, their contents written in Edmund's hand. But it was the other documents that chilled Isaac, the ledgers, written not by the master, but by a servant's careful script. These are yours? He asked. I kept records, he said quietly. All those years in the kitchen, listening. Men talk freely when they believe the one serving them does not understand. I wrote it all down, the shipments, the bribes, the names. Helena stared at him, stunned. You've had this all along? I learned from Dr. Thorne that knowledge is the only safe rebellion, Isaac said. I meant to use it one day, when I found someone willing to listen. For the first time since her husband's death, Helena laughed a low, bitter sound edged with wonder. Then you and I have been plotting the same vengeance from different prisons. Together they spread the papers across the floor, ledgers from the kitchen, letters from the study, bills of sale and receipts that painted a portrait of rot beneath Charleston's polish. Names appeared again and again. Magistrates, merchants, clergymen, even Marcus himself. By candlelight, they began to organize the evidence. Isaac's handwriting flowed beside hers, the two scripts interlacing as if fate had always intended it. When at last the clock struck midnight, Helena leaned back in her chair, exhausted but alive with purpose. We'll send copies north, she said, to Philadelphia, to Boston, where the abolitionists print their papers. Let them tell the story Charleston hides. Isaac nodded slowly. And when they come for us, then they'll find we've already spoken louder than they can silence. Outside, the wind moved through the oaks, carrying the faint smell of salt from the harbor. Within the dying light, two people, one woman, exiled by her race, one man freed by his silence, had begun to turn a scandal into a revolution. The wager had birthed shame, but out of that shame had come something sharper than vengeance, purpose. And purpose, once set loose, was a weapon neither Marcus nor Charleston could contain. The fire began 3 weeks after the wedding, on a moonless night when the marshes shimmered faintly under heat lightning. It started in the cotton house at the edge of Rosemont's fields, a low, timbered building where the season's bales were stacked to dry. By the time the first sparks leapt skyward, the workers had already scattered, and the night air filled with the smell of burning resin and ash. Helena woke to the sound of shouting. From her window, she saw the orange glow rising beyond the oak grove, and for a fleeting second, she thought the sun had come early. Then came the crack of wood, the roar of the fire feeding on dry cotton, and the unmistakable panic of horses breaking from their stalls. She ran barefoot into the corridor, calling for Isaac. He was already outside, a bucket in hand, his face slick with sweat and smoke. The blaze painted him in gold and shadow, his movements impossibly steady amid chaos. "It's too late to save the cotton," he shouted over the wind. "We keep it from reaching the house." Helena joined the line of servants and freedmen passing buckets from the well, their silhouettes ghostly in the red light. The flames climbed like a living thing, consuming the walls with terrible grace. When the roof collapsed, a cry went up from the crowd, not fear, but fury. Everyone knew this was no accident. By dawn, the cotton house was a blackened shell. The ground smoked under the first pale light, the air thick with the acrid stench of ruin. As the embers cooled, Isaac found what he'd expected: the clear imprint of boot heels near the rear door, the faint smell of kerosene, and a trail of wagon ruts leading back toward the main road. Helena stood beside him, her face gray with exhaustion. "Marcus," she said simply. Isaac nodded. "Or those who think they serve him." That afternoon, a messenger arrived from Charleston, a thin boy with no hat and fear in his eyes. He carried a folded note, sealed in green wax. Helena opened it without ceremony. The letter was unsigned, but the handwriting was Marcus's. "You have made your bed with fire. The city will no longer tolerate your blasphemy. Leave before the flames reach your door." She folded the letter once and handed it to Isaac. "Then we prepare for the fire," she said. But the fire came not as flame next time, but as fists. 2 nights later, Isaac rode into town for medicine and did not return until morning, bloodied, limping, his coat torn at the shoulder. "They waited near the dock," he said, his voice calm but frayed at the edges. 3 men, faces covered, said they were delivering God's justice. Helena felt the floor tilt beneath her. She moved toward him instinctively, reaching for his arm, but he pulled back gently. "I'm all right," he said. "They wanted to scare me, not kill me. Not yet." She sat heavily at the table, trembling with rage. "Then, we strike first. We send the letters now. Every name, every number. Let the North see what Charleston hides." Isaac hesitated. "Once those papers leave this house, there is no return. We'll be hunted as traitors." "We already are," she said. Together they worked through the night, copying the ledgers, sealing each package with wax and wrapping them in linen. Helena wrote a final note in her own hand. Truth survives only when spoken aloud. At dawn, they entrusted the bundles to a Quaker merchant who promised to send them north by ship. When the messenger's cart disappeared down the long road to the harbor, Helena turned to Isaac. "It's done," she said. He looked toward the horizon, where Charleston's spires rose faintly against the morning haze. "Then so are we," he replied. By afternoon, word had already begun to spread that the widow of Rosemont had turned abolitionist, that she was sending lies to the Yankees. Some said bounty men were coming for them. Others claimed the church that married them had been boarded up by order of the city. That night, as wind swept through the burned-out cotton field, Helena stood at the threshold of her ruined home. She felt no fear, only an odd stillness, as if the world had already judged her and moved on. Behind her, Isaac's footsteps approached softly. "They'll come," he said. "I know," she replied. "But they'll come too late. The truth's already gone north." The flames that had begun in the cotton house had spread again, this time on paper, carried by ships and wind and outrage. It would burn slower than kerosene, but longer, and in the quiet between them, Helena understood that their survival no longer mattered. Only the fire did. November 17th, 1834. Charleston awoke to the sound of bells. Not church bells, warning bells. Somewhere near Meeting Street, a body had been found in one of the upstairs rooms of the Charleston Club. By noon, word had spread to every tavern and dock. Marcus Whitmore was dead. The newspapers, careful and evasive, called it a tragedy of ill health and overindulgence. But those who had seen the scene told a darker story. Marcus had been discovered slumped over his desk, a bottle of laudanum half empty beside him, the smell of opium heavy in the air. His eyes were open, his mouth slack, his fingertips stained with ink. Scattered across the blotter were unfinished letters, accusations, names, and a single torn page that read only, "They will hang us all if she speaks." When Helena heard the news, she was sitting by the window of Rosemont's library, staring at the skeletal remains of the cotton fields. The messenger who brought the letter from town waited silently as she read. "It appears," she said at last, folding the note, "that my brother has joined the men he feared." Isaac looked up from the desk where he had been sorting correspondence. "Do you think it was his choice?" She shook her head. "Marcus never chose anything. He only ran out of ways to pretend he had control." That evening, Helena found herself wandering the corridors of Rosemont, moving from room to room like a spirit haunting her own house. The walls still bore the soot stains from the night of the fire. The furniture had been sold to pay off what debts she could. Only the library remained untouched. On the shelves lay the copies of the ledgers they had sent north, their secrets now public. Weeks earlier, the abolitionist papers in Philadelphia and Boston had begun printing serialized accounts of the Whitmore Papers documents, detailing the hidden transactions of Charleston's most powerful families. The fallout had been immediate. Northern investors withdrew their money. Southern banks panicked. Magistrates denied their signatures. The scandal had cracked Charleston's foundation, and though no one said it aloud, everyone knew who had struck the blow. That night, Helena sat at her husband's desk, rereading Marcus's final note. She felt neither triumph nor relief, only a quiet sorrow for a man who had believed cruelty could preserve order. Outside, thunder rolled again, but it was distant, fading toward the sea. Isaac entered the room carrying a candle. His injuries from the attack had nearly healed, though he still moved with a slight limp. He placed the light on the table. "There will be retribution," he said softly. "Men like Marcus leave behind friends more dangerous than themselves." "I know," she said, "but what they fear has already happened. The truth is free now. It no longer belongs to us." He studied her for a moment, then asked, "And what do we belong to, Helena?" She smiled faintly. "To the fire we started, I suppose." In the days that followed, small changes rippled through Charleston. The magistrate Cornelius Ashford quietly resigned. Several planters were indicted for fraud. The AME Church reopened under a different name. Though Reverend Whitfield was gone, no one knew where. The Quaker Meeting House closed its doors, but continued to send letters north. And among the city's freedmen, the story of a white widow and her husband who defied the law spread like an invisible gospel, spoken in kitchens and alleys, always in whispers. By winter, Rosemont was nearly deserted. The fields lay fallow, the shutters warped by rain. One night, as fog crept up from the marshes, Helena stood beside Isaac on the veranda, watching the mist roll in. "Do you ever think," she asked, "that we've merely traded one kind of prison for another?" Isaac's gaze followed the dark horizon. "Every prison has a door," he said. "Ours just leads further than most." She turned toward him. "And if they come for us, then they'll find ashes," he said quietly. Behind them, the house creaked in the wind, its timbers whispering like old secrets. The fire that had once consumed Rosemont was gone, but its light had traveled on, carried by rumor, by paper, by those who refused to forget. And somewhere in Charleston's archives, between the pages of a ledger, the wager remained. Helena Whitmore's name written beside Isaac's, the terms of her defiance signed in ink and sealed in blood. The story of their ruin would outlive them both, but so, too, would the truth.